Hello everyone and welcome. In the previous video, we looked at the Graph API and we saw that the Graph API is the explicit way to build LangGraph applications. And in the Graph API, what we define is state graph, state, nodes, edges, conditional edges, compile, and invoke. So that approach is very clear because we can see the entire structure like nodes, edges, and entire graph in a visual workflow. So that becomes much more clear. Now, in this video, we will look into the second way of building LangGraph applications. That is by using functional API. So the functional API is useful when we want to write code that feels closer to the normal Python. And instead of explicitly building the graph with nodes and edges, so we define tasks and an entry point, and then we use normal Python if statements and for loops to build that particular flow. So the main idea is simple, like Graph API makes the workflow structure explicit. We can visually see that workflow how it is going. And functional API keeps the workflow closer to the normal Python code. So when we look at why functional API even exists in the first place, why can't we can use always Graph API, right? Let us go through step by step on this. Sometimes we already have existing Python code. For example, maybe we already have functions for classifying an email, checking customer history, drafting a response, or escalating to a ticket. In that case, we may not want to write the entire functions again in LangGraph nodes and edges. Instead of that, we want to use the existing Python ecosystem and plug into the LangGraph core capabilities, right? That's where the functional API helps here. It's let us keep a more familiar Python structure, and we're still getting LangGraph capabilities like persistence, streaming, interrupts, and memory. And that is the core reason why functional API exists. Now we actually looking into the key building blocks in functional API, which is basically task and entry point. A task is a unit of work. It is similar to what we call nodes in Graph API. And for example, like classify email, draft response, ask follow-up questions, escalate to human, everything we will create a functions over there. Similarly, we also create functions here, but we use some annotation like at the rate task to define that particular function as a task. And if you look at the second building block, which is the entry point, an entry point is the main workflow function, and it is the way the flow gets started. And inside the entry point, we can define like calling a task, use if statements, use loops, and return the final results as well. So if you look at it from a structure point of view, the functional API feels like more regular Python coding, but with LangGraph runtime support underneath. Let us use the same customer support example that we used to build our Graph API use cases. So the input is an email here again, and we want to classify it. And based on the classification, we generate the response according to that. Basically, if it is a refund issue, we will return it as a refund response. If it is a technical issue, we will send it as a technical response back. In case of it is unclear, we will ask for more information. So in the Graph API, we model this using nodes and edges, but in the functional API, we use the key building blocks, task and entry point. Now let us look into the what task really does here. It is basically a Python function, but we will actually use at the rate task annotation to wrap that entire function as a task. And if you look at it like classify email, draft response, ask follow up, escalate, all of these are actually Python functions. It is similar to what we use nodes concept as well in Graph API. Now let us look into what entry point really does here. The entry point is the main function, and this is where the workflow will start. And inside the entry point, we can actually define first the entire workflow. Like first we'll classify the email, then check the category, then decide which response to create, and then return the result. So the entry point is like controller of the workflow. Now we naturally come to the point that what is the main difference between Graph API and functional API and when to choose what, right? If you look at the Graph API, the structure is outside the functions. We say add this node, add this edge, add this conditional edge, compile the graph. And in the functional API, the structure is inside the function body. So we say call this particular task. If this condition is true, do this. Otherwise, do that. It's more of like how we write the program in Python. Both approaches represent workflows, but they feel different because in Graph API, we can visually see what is going from a graph point of view, like start, node, and then edges, nodes. But in the functional API, everything is wrapped inside the code. Now we need to understand when functional API is really useful. As mentioned, like if you already have existing Python functions and you don't want to write again from the scratch into LangGraph, in that case, you can straight away use functional API to get the benefits out of it. And the second case is your flow is easier to understand, and it is much better to read it as a code instead of graph. Then definitely we can go for functional API. So when not to prefer the functional API approach, if you have many branches and you are actually working with a really complex problem and you want to really see the visual workflow and how the flow is moving from one direction to another direction, in that case functional API may not be the better place to start with. Before we move to the next steps, one important point I would like to make it is both APIs are still part of LangGraph only. So even though the code looks more like Python code, the execution is still supported by LangGraph underneath. Now let us go through the Visual Studio code and then see how functional API works. So I already created a scripts.py here, and we can see here we got three functions altogether. One is classify email, second one is draft response, and we got one more function called support workflow. These two are basically, if you look into the Graph API, these two are nodes, right? But here it is task. So we are using at the rate task annotation, and then those and classify email method and draft response method is wrapped inside the task. And we have one more method is called support workflow, where we actually define the step by step. If the input email is, now we are actually calling to the next step is classify email. The classify email, it can actually categorize it as refund or technical issues. All other cases it is general. Once we receive the category, then it will assign to the draft response. The draft response can actually draft the response based on the category, which is a refund. We can send this information back. If it is a technical one, we will send this information back. All other cases, we will send this return statement. So that's what it is going here. And then this method is returning email, category, and final response back. And we can see here we actually wrapped this entire method inside the entry point annotation. So that's pretty much like we got three methods. One is classify email, second one is draft response. These two are wrapped inside a task. And the last method, which is support workflow, where we actually performing the end-to-end steps, that is wrapped inside the entry point. And finally, we got support workflow.invoke, and we're actually sending here, I'm not happy with your services, provide refund, and we are printing the result here and see what's the response that we're going to get. So I'm not happy with your services, provide refund. Category is refund, and response, we have received your refund request. Our billing team will review it. This is great. And then let's go to the next one, which is again, I cannot log into the application. In this case, it is a technical exception, and we can see we have received your technical issue and our support team will investigate it. As mentioned, there's nothing changes. It's purely written in Python. We cannot see anything visually, but the entire workflow pretty much remains constant. We need to use Graph API when you want explicit workflow structure, you want to see visually and how it is going. So definitely go for Graph API. And if you want to migrate from existing Python code and you gradually move to LangGraph, then your entire code base will be in Python based. In that case, you can use functional API to write normal Python code. And again, both are useful and both are supported by LangGraph, and both uses the same LangGraph runtime. That's pretty much for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next.